Welcome to Eastcounty Pathways. Today I'm very happy to have a friend of many years, Dr. Howard Dewey, who is a clinical psychologist practicing in Portland. This is old stuff for us since many years ago. We did a program for about 3 years called The Bible, Freud, and Daily Living. You remember that?
I certainly do.
And we used to take Bible stories and talk about them, and you'd psychoanalyze them, and I'd theologize over them and all of this. Well, welcome back to the scene here. And first of all, let's talk a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about your practice and where you are and where you've been and some of the things you're doing. And
Well, to look back over that kind of period of time, there have been many changes. I used to do a lot more work with children, for one thing, than I do now. I see many more adults, often young adults, 20 to 35-year-olds. Perhaps they're more accepting of psychology than our generation. That's been the major battle in psychology, is just for acceptance. You know, it's always been honorable to have a physical illness, but somehow dishonorable to have a mental illness or emotional problem. And everyone should be strong enough to carry their own, problems on their own shoulders, all that kind of stuff. Most of the people I deal with are perfectionists. And it's a very difficult thing to get many of them to be better to themselves and as good to themselves as they tend to be to others.
Well, tell me a little bit about perfectionism. What's the source of perfectionism? What's this all about?
Well, I suppose it predated Christ, but it's certainly easy to look at Christ as the model for perfect behavior, perfect self-control, perfect love. And I think that to a great extent, his teachings has permeated our society and have made us perfectionists, which I think is just unrealistic. You know, I just don't know people who don't make mistakes, who don't have problems, who don't realize that they could have handled something differently. But they get very upset with themselves, go through a self-punishment kind of routine in one form or another, and then they're ready to do it again. The compulsive nature of perfectionism is the hard part. It has a hold on people that they find difficult to let go.
It's interesting, as you were talking, it occurred to me that maybe the last adjective I'd use to describe Jesus of Nazareth was a perfectionist, and that we look at him as the perfect human being, as the model for all humans and everything, but that was no big thing with him, it seems to me. He sort of freewheeled, was able to shift and so forth. So there's a difference between the kind of perfectionism that maybe he calls us to and he lived, and the kind of neurotic perfectionism that you're talking about. If I make a mistake, somebody's going to reject me type of thing.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying in terms of perfectionism is not all bad, like anything. That it is good to try and stretch one's abilities and to achieve things and to do them as well as one can. But the obsessive quality to the neurotic perfectionist is the bad part of it. And if they can let go of that unreasonable, it gets so it covers many areas of their lives. And if it's more confined, it would allow them more time for enjoyment of life, which I think is, to me, the goal of life, is to learn how to live it without resenting it or fearing it. Yeah.
Now, as you look back to the 60s, there was a kind of, I wouldn't say a sloppy sort of attitude towards life that anything goes. Now, this is sort of the opposite extreme to perfectionism. Now, are you saying that there's been a sort of a radical change maybe in mental illness because of our society, where we've moved from a kind of a disorganized, kind of sloppy way of life where anything goes to everything has to be so, and so we've moved to kind of more of has it been the growth in the electronic age and the machine and the predictability of computers and all this? What's behind all this?
Well, I think there's a growing sense of helplessness and futility with our own organizations. Our own systems seem to me to be pretty much out of hand. President Reagan in some ways is trying to bring some things into control, but unfortunately in a capitalistic state you've got to have the poor. You know, it's just calls for that. And I just, as a psychologist and something of a humanitarian, I just can't respect our society for not finding ways to deal with those people who are truly disadvantaged, brutalized by life. And I think that, going back to the 60s, the flower children and the call to love was a nice call, but it just hasn't held up in the face of the reality of pressures of daily living. And when we struggle with those, I wonder how those people with resources that are nowhere near the average person's resources can ever survive, you know, in a healthy way. Well, we've got to really create more environments for them to realize their potential. We destroy them with their dependency on us.
Do you feel the way things are on a national level, the kind of traumas that we're in as we think of nuclear possibilities for war and so forth, affect the people's, the individual state of mind and their proneness to mental illness and so forth? Is there a relationship? Is there a tie-over between the two?
I really do think so. I remember the bomb scare back in '62, '63, somewhere around in there. That everyone became much more conscious of the destructive power of the weapons. And since then, it's grown and grown. And I do think that there is that kind of, there's on the one hand the hope that our leaders will resolve these problems. And, you know, there are some good signs for that, but it's imperative, you know. We can't continue to live with that kind of tension when there's sufficient tension just in the daily processing of interrelating with one another. I think it goes beyond our ability to. I think people get desperate or get I don't care attitude. I'll live for today. You know, there may not be a tomorrow. And every time the global situation heats up, I think it feeds that kind of selfish introspection that says get pleasure now and how you can. Destructive to mental health.
One of the interesting things has been many of those who were the revolutionaries of the 60s are now the yuppies, so to speak. I don't know if this has been grossly overworked or not. Have you any observation of this? Much of middle-class America, are they the ones who were once protesting are now pretty much in the system? Or?
Well, I think I've finally reached that age where I certainly do see the pendulum-like swing to many of the processes of life. And I think we are in a swing toward more responsibility, more accountability, and that's good. Except it all boils down to the kind of individual goodwill that people really have, and unfortunately we seem to bring the problems of our childhood and our family life into the workplace. And then we run into the difficulties of its personalities rather than the goal and the job that becomes the issue. And we're pretty immature in many ways, I think, still.
Is there a reversal where the problems of the workplace also come into family life and
absolutely.
So it's a kind of a two-way street there.
Yeah, one of the movements that seems to me to hold the most promise and yet causes the most trouble is, to me, the women's equality movement. I think it's excellent. I think that it has to happen. The women have to have an equal share in both the responsibility and the rights of living. But in the process, the getting along between men and women for many people has become increasingly difficult because the woman does not take the usual conventional role that most of us were raised by women who performed in that role. But again, I think it's necessary that it happen.
The male ego has to make some modifications.
Absolutely.
And, is your observation that maybe the male is not able to move as quickly and to adjust as quickly as the female, or is there a difference there?
I doubt that. I think that the male is not used to being challenged, and he doesn't take challenge well. But if he will accept that challenge to find out how another person views the world and that they're equal to him, the world becomes a more interesting place than where you have women in a certain kind of category and pigeonhole. You know, they become living, people who you must deal with, or leave them alone, one of the two. And I think that's good.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to mental illness and the whole matter of the psyche, of course, as you said, it's respectable to be physically sick, but not to be mentally or spiritually ill. And of course, there's been a lot of movement in this direction, too. I often feel, though, that psychology and psychiatry are still somewhat in the bloodletting stage, where we really don't know as much about the human psyche and what's really happening. There's a whole matter of the chemistry of the body and how much of it is physiological, how much is psychological, how much is physical. Are there strides being made in this?
Oh, you know, it seems to me like it's the same as in physics, that the more we know, the less we know. Except, I will say that in psychology especially, they've developed techniques which will work for almost any problem if you'll practice them. They're basic, simple things that have been going on for years. Affirmations, you know, self-affirmations, and reprogramming of thinking or controlling obsessive thinking by spending 15 minutes in self-criticism and then avoid it the rest of the day. You know, if you got to do it, try and encapsulate it. Desensitization to phobic conditions, they get about an 85% cure rate on phobias now with desensitization. Biofeedback, relaxation, that's an embarrassing one to me. When I first started to practice here in Portland, there were a group of psychiatrists, Dixon and Dickel, and we used to scoff at those psychiatrists, those men who we believed were charlatans. They were teaching relaxation. And I'm embarrassed to say that, you know, now we have come to a full realization that relaxation is, if you don't learn to relax, you probably won't learn to solve your problems. You know, it just is a necessary thing to do, because we forget what it is to be relaxed in the process of daily living, unless we concertedly make an effort to do that.
I remember being in your office, I saw a biofeedback machine. Is biofeedback helping people to relax?
It certainly is. Deep breathing is the simplest process you can go through. You can't be anxious and deep breathe at the same time, and you carry that one with you wherever you go. Progressive relaxation, where you tighten up areas of your body and then release them, so that you get the contrast between relaxed and not relaxed. Yeah. The other thing, though, that is more in your field is that there is in almost every treatment program a concept of turning to a higher power.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. And Alcoholics Anonymous kind of set the tone for that. But it's also found to be effective, that those people who do learn to surrender, in a sense, to whatever they believe in as a higher power, do better than those who try and do it all by themselves, you might say. So.
That's fascinating. You know, when I was in seminary back in the 40s, I studied under a man by the name of William Sadler, doctor, who's a psychiatrist, and has written a great deal, and he was a student of Freud, and he used to say that 98% of the psychiatrists in the United States were atheists. And really, religion and psychiatry had no meeting point. Apparently, that's changed somewhat.
It's changed somewhat. I certainly wouldn't want to make an estimate anymore. I'm not that much in touch with the younger colleagues, I don't think, to know. But certainly, you won't get scoffed at now if you express some kind of spiritual belief. And many psychologists, psychiatrists do have personal belief now, which may not have been true back then. Yeah.
Back in the early 70s and late 60s, there were a lot of sort of semi-intellectual schools, I'd say, almost like transactional analysis and Eric Berne and some of these. And there seemed to be almost a proliferation of various types of therapies and schools of thought that were not so much a radical change from Freudianism as they were more in techniques and ways of doing things. Am I right that these have somewhat vanished from the scene, somewhat, and it's more of
They've all left an emphasis, though. Eric Byrne is one of the, especially has been effective in terms of, we commonly will say to patients, and I hear other therapists do this too, talk about the child in them or the parent in them. You don't do that with everyone because not everyone can accept that kind of concept, but a lot of people put emphasis in particular areas, and I think most of us have become aware of what a range of approaches there are to people, and that seems to me to be pretty necessary, because you try and deal with them all the same way. You're just talking to yourself, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is Freud still looked at as sort of the father of psychology? Pretty respected still, and
by me, I certainly wouldn't want to estimate how he's accepted now by the younger people. The debt that I think we owe him is for explaining the unconscious and the subconscious and its control over our lives. Hypnosis in particular is, I think, made that very clear, that that's a strong influence, the unconscious, and that it permeates all that we do. And the better we understand it, the more self-control we then have. And so yeah, he's still, he's being attacked a lot lately, but that's probably about time for that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Carl Jung came up with this idea of archetypes and all of this, where we have within us something of the down deep from our roots. If we have a German root, we have certain archetypes and so forth. Is that still somewhat held? Or?
You don't hear that kind of language very much, except from Jungians, but Jung has had, he's had the spiritual influence in the whole field, a lot of it. He's still so widely respected for his own skills in dealing with people. He was, is more correct, an effective teacher and healer, and he had skills that most of us don't have, really, from what my understanding of his work is.
Now, as you think of the psychologist, the clinical psychologist and the psychiatrist, what are the difference between the two?
Well, I'm prejudiced, of course. The major difference is that a medical doctor goes through medical school and has that 4 years training, which unfortunately he probably never uses again, because from there on he will go to 2 to 3 year, usually 3 year programs of internship, where he's trained by psychiatrists to do therapy and evaluation, diagnosis, and the treatment through medicine. A psychologist, let me say one more thing, is that training in and of itself seems to set psychiatrists somewhat apart from the population as a whole, gives them a role and a responsibility that I think is a very difficult one to fill. Psychology is fortunate. We deal only with the mind, and if there is a need for something physically, why, then we hand it over. But our training is, I think, somewhat superior, and we're not, I think, separated psychologically and socially as much as medical doctors.
Now, as a psychologist, you cannot use a tranquilizer.
No.
So as a result, probably you don't depend nearly so much on medication as a psychiatrist.
That's true, and when you do have patients who need medications, you nearly always have a physician who will cooperate. They are good about cooperating with psychologists. But we go through 5 years or 4 years of college, and most of us major in clinical psychology, and then a master's degree, which takes at least 2 years, and then another 3 years for the PhD, and another year after that for an internship. So we got a lot of intensive training in our field that, and again, don't seem to lose as much touch as the responsibilities of psychiatrists cause them to lose. Yeah. We're less threatening, I think, although I think we're somewhat threatening too. People still have ideas that we can read minds and that kind of thing. It's interesting. The fears.
I remember when I was working more in the field of psychology and finally got my doctorate in social psychology, but people used to think when I shook hands with them going out of church that I was reading them and looking down into them and all this. I think they've got away from that. But it's fascinating that people think that psychologists are, well, you know, what is he thinking now and what's going on there? Yeah. When I presume that's the last thing that enters your mind when you're talking with somebody.
Well, you, like anyone else, you notice things, but when it's not your responsibility to react to it, why, it's just like life, you know, and there's nothing to respond to in social settings, usually. Yeah.
Now, what about the physiological and the physical roots of mental illness? When you think of the psychiatrists using tranquilizers and so forth, and they do affect things, and we do know now there's chemical imbalances in the brain sometimes, that, and of course it's the old chicken and egg idea. Yes. Does the chemical imbalance cause the illness, or does the illness cause the chemical imbalance? Where are you in all this? Has there been some changes in feelings about this in the last few years? Or?
Oh gosh, I've become more and more solidly convinced that it all starts with what we think and feel. And those two things together can cause illness or they can cause health. And for most of us, they cause some of both. You know, I've seen too many people who break down with stress with physical symptoms. And when the stress is removed, why, their physical symptoms will improve, unless they've learned a victim's role, and then you've got a little different kind of problem on your hand.
What do you mean by the victim's role?
Well, unfortunately, women particularly have been cast in the role of the victim of their husband's disrespect, mistreatment, or mistreatment, and have tended to see themselves as put upon, hurt, downtrodden, and they have not had much support in society for standing up to the man. And finally, our society is beginning to provide some havens for those women who do want to break that pattern, because if they don't break it, they get farther and farther into that pattern of feeling helpless and that it's all their fault, that there's something really wrong with them. And women are very prone to feel like when things go wrong, it's their fault. I should have done something to make it all well, you know, be the good mother.
We hear a lot about child abuse and wife abuse today. Has this been always with us and is only surfacing now, or is it something that is progressively growing worse?
I suspect it's been with us a lot more than we cared to know. I think it may be worse, the worse the pressures get on our society. The poor men in our society just do not take poverty well. They lose their self-respect, and they often take their anger out on women. And they're often perfectionists too, surprisingly or not.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, especially the abusers of children. They want those children to be perfect, and they're just kind of insane with their need for the child to mind, you know, do what I say, and they get violent around it. Usually they've been brutalized themselves.
Now, your family, like mine, have grown up. If you were going to be a parent again, what are some of the things that you would do?
The very first thing I'd do would be to take a parent effectiveness training course. I really would. You know, I think you can learn a lot of ideas about how to approach problem behavior. And I look back and I did the same thing over and over again until I got sick of it and could see that it was hurting my children, and then I'd probably finally change. But I could have done better, you know, I really could have. A lot more love, a lot more consideration for their feelings, and a lot more sticking to the right responsibilities. Yeah, I was sometimes too tough, too loose, you know, that. It's too bad.
Yeah. The model I developed is there's a sort of a circle, and the child is on the inside and the parent is on the outside, and the child is pushing for more living space, and the parent is releasing and holding.
Yes.
And most times the pressure works pretty well. If the parent has enough flexibility to release where they need to and hold where they need to, and the children's learning curve is a very fast one. We're around the curve, and
yes.
So the child always feels they're more advanced, the parent always feels they're less advanced, and so the pressure goes on. And
Yes.
Now, as you freeze and get tight, then you hold the circle too close, you're saying to the child, you're no good, you can't handle this responsibility.
That's right.
If you release it too quickly and give the child more freedom, you're saying, well, I don't care, do it the way you want to. Is that pretty much it?
That says it very well, Arthur. That's absolutely true, yes.
And so you have to know where to hold the line and where to release, and that takes insight and perspective. And
I also look at it as shifting from being a parent to being an adult with my adult children, and stopping a lot of those parental kinds of messages that they're old enough by now. They've got their own set of messages going, and if they're working for them, that's great. If they're not, why, most people are intelligent enough to recognize when things should be changed.
One of the humorous things I found with my boys is now they tend to become parental with me and say, Dad, don't work so hard, you're doing that. And I had a little flare-up with my illness back a few months, and they became very concerned, surround me in a very parental way. And that's interesting and fascinating, kind of likable in a way. And then you begin to say, hey, I'm getting squeezed in too.
Yes, yes.
And,
life is a fascinating kind of process. I like the view from this age better than I liked the earlier years, frankly. But I was more troubled in my own mind in those days. So,
But there's well, as you think of the scene as you've seen it over the years, are there different kinds of mental illness today than, say, there were 25 years ago? Are the same, or are there different nuances to it? Or are you still pretty much the same? Or?
No, there are changes. You know, it's rare to see a eating disorder in a child, a young child. Most parents are not nearly as pushy about food as they were when I was raised, more relaxed about it. But then the problems of anorexia and bulimia that affect the young people, those are more pronounced. Suicide is up. There's so many ways that we show the symptoms of not coping well with all the pressures and changes in our society. The positive things are that we are more aware of what's going on and more aware of the help available to face some of these problems. I think it is becoming more acceptable to have emotional problems. The drug problem in our society is beginning to take the lid off of the business that it's always symptomatic of someone who is too stressed and not coping as well as they need to with the stresses of their life, so they turn to something else to escape it, and it's there tomorrow. So it's an endless battle. But as we see that there are more and more of us disturbed, well, I think there'll be more and more effort to change things in a direction that reduces some of those tensions.
And you just opened up a whole lot of doors. We're going to have to do another one, maybe on drugs and all of this.
That's an interesting
We've
one.
been very happy that you've stayed with us in Eastcounty Pathways, and our guest has been Dr. Howard Dewey, a clinical psychologist, and I think you've seen that this field is so vast that in half an hour we can only touch the fringes, but at least we've covered some of the ground. And I hope we can have you back, Howard, perhaps to do something on drugs in specifics, or maybe on some of the new things like bulimia and anorexia, things we haven't talked about very much.
Yeah.
And until very recent times, and now they seem to be coming to the fore. And they're kind of pressure things, aren't they? That and maybe result from the pressure in our society, and so maybe that's a good place to get started in it. And,
Well, I enjoyed being here.
so that'll give us a chance to ask you back. Thank you
you
for being with us.